If you're editing your novel again and you feel drained, exhausted, or demotivated, this video is for you. Here are 5 tips to make this process more effective and less miserable, then 3 bonus tips on how to avoid the situation to begin with. Also, hi, I'm Silver. My credentials are this novel that I edited to the point that I could probably recite it. But I never lost hope and neither should you. Point is, I'm not talking out of my butt. I use these tips and they work. Without further ado, tip number 1 is focus on what matters. You may think that I mean like, oh, focus on the theme of your story and the general plot. No, you are the only person who knows what matters in your story. Is it the plot that is the center of your narrative, or is it the characters and the change they undergo? Is it your beautiful literary writing? All of these are legitimate answers, but you have to pick one thing to focus on. Think about this from a reader's perspective. If you're reading a book and enjoying it because the flowery language makes you feel things, would you really care about a minor plot inconsistency? Of course, it would be better if your book was perfect, and it can matter to you, but it likely wouldn't matter as much to your reader. Keep that in mind. Tip number 2 would have you ask a question. Would you like to pad your manuscript or cut it? If you want to pad it, there are so many ways to go about it. Like adding scenes, adding characters, adding plot lines, whatever. But this tip is specific for minor padding. Something a lot of writers overlook, and I think it's a shame, is describing sensory experiences. Add descriptions of sound, of smell, of sensation. They can make your story so immersive, and you only have to add a few words. Also, if you're somebody who doesn't describe these things usually, it will be fun to edit because of the novelty of writing something new, something we are severely lacking in this stage of editing. If you want to cut your manuscript, once again, you have to identify what you can afford to cut. For me, I usually have to cut good chunks, so I cut off characters. But something minor you could adjust are, for example, dialogue tags, which add flair and I love them, but they usually can be removed without impacting your reader's understanding of the story. Now for the big guns, the 3 major tips I think you should always apply when editing. Number 1, change fonts between every edit. One of the major issues when editing so many times is that you become familiar with your text to the point that you really can't see mistakes even if they're right there. Changing the font obviously won't change the manuscript, but it will force you to read it again while you're editing. This is especially helpful if you're trying to detect missing words, as in you wrote a sentence and one of the words, for example, A, is missing and you can't find that issue because you know what the sentence is supposed to be. You're familiar with it. The next step also works to avert familiarity, but it can also alleviate your boredom. And that is read your text out loud, always when you edit. Not only can it help you identify the pacing of your own pace, like finding sentences that are too long or too short, or things that are unclear or messy in some way, it also adds a layer of novelty because there's an extra sense involved in the editing process. Genuinely, try it right now. It is incredibly helpful. It is my ace up my sleeve always. The last tip is a bummer and you already know it, which doesn't make it suck any less. Take a break. Nothing will make the editing process more effective or enjoyable than taking a step back and leaving your manuscript to lie for a little bit. In the end, we usually write the sort of books that we as readers would enjoy. Not only that, it's enough time for your brain to forget certain nuances to your story, which allows you to analyze it with more scrutiny. I know it's not always an option, especially if you have deadlines, but even doing something like not touching your manuscript for a week and reading a bazillion other books in that time can refresh your mind in the same way. As for avoiding this much editing, I have to once again convince you that I know what I'm talking about. So here's a video of how I wrote the first draft of my next novel in 1 week, but wait, there's more. The time it took me in total to take this from an idea to a fully refined book is less than 1 month. That is a generous estimate. And the reason why is because I only edited it 3 times in total over the course of the whole process. Here's how you can achieve the same. Tip number 1 is writing an outline. I know not everybody enjoys it. I used to kinda hate it too, but it's immensely helpful. Writing an outline is effectively a few hours of work that give you a bird's eye view of your whole manuscript. You can identify plot holes before they even exist. Imagine how many revisions you can save if your first draft doesn't have any plot holes. If you have very clear arcs for every characters from draft 1. I go into a lot of detail detail on writing a good outline and first draft in the video I mentioned, so feel free to watch that if you want more information. For now, let's move to tip number 2. Once you have an outline, you don't just edit. There are 2 types of edits that you have to do to refine your manuscript, and you should not do them together. The first one is a structural edit. In this stage, you find plot holes and stitch them shut, for example. Or you realize that you introduced your antagonist too late into the story. Or maybe your inciting incident is on chapter 7 and it needs to be in chapter 3. As soon as you have a first draft, that is what you need to identify. There is no point fixing typos and perfecting your grammar and writing beautiful paragraphs if you don't know whether or not they will stay in the final manuscript. Because changing the structure of your novel is inevitably going to change a lot of things. For example, which characters will actually exist by the end of your structural editing process. As an example, in this stage of the editing process in my next novel, I had to remove 1.5 characters and a few pretty important scenes, so I had to adjust other important scenes as a consequence. Once your structural editing is done and you're confident in the heart and soul of your manuscript, all that's left is to refine it. That's where you pour all your knowledge of the craft as a writer into your work. That is when you write paragraphs that touch the soul. That is when you fix typos or adjust sentences to be more clear or coherent. If you have confidence in the structure of your story, you know that any beautiful words you will write will actually make it to the final project. This too can take a few rounds of editing, but you effectively minimize the process. This is the minimum number of edits you can do on your manuscript. Last but not least is version control. You can use Git, you can use different Word documents, you can use any writing app, you can use physical copies. Doesn't matter, just keep versions of every one of your edits. Meaning you write your first draft, you save it separately, and then you edit in a different document or something. And the reason why is because sometimes you make a change that later down the line you think, oh shoot, I don't like this. And instead of having to rewrite it again, you can just fetch or pluck one from another version. Every version of your manuscript is precious. Don't discard it. That's all for my tips, but I am not done because I want to tell you that while the process of editing is really difficult, I know it, trust me, I've been there. Remember, your story might one day become somebody else's favorite. This video was also a request by somebody I'll be keeping anonymous, so that is your friendly reminder that I do take requests. If you have questions or something you would like me to discuss, ask away. Be it in my comments or in the DMs of any of my socials. I'll be happy to help. If you found this video valuable or entertaining, I would really appreciate it if you liked it. Also, please subscribe so that I have an excuse to keep making these videos. And here is once again the video I talked about earlier. Thank you for watching, good luck, and happy writing!